Today, a short introduction to critical community psychology and an introduction to the bird life of Queensland. So apart from turning up on time and making sure a few months and 1, 2, 3, it's all urge you to think critically and not speak like me. Stop doing stupid things. And so, critical community psychology. What's that about? Well, what you could do is read the book that is called Critical Community Psychology, written by myself and some colleagues from Manchester in the UK. And that means that I would get some royalties. Then I'd be happy. Actually, you don't need to buy the book. It's pretty simple, actually simple and complicated. I'll give you my take on things. So largely it's about an analysis of power. It's about understanding how truth is made by people who have power, and those truths are imposed upon people who don't have power, often to the benefit of those in power. So critical community psychology really is about extending that political analysis to the work that we do. Why would you need to put the descriptor critical in front of community psychology? It kind of suggests that something must be wrong with community psychology. You know, it's like a country putting democratic in front of its name, like the Democratic Republic of Congo or the Democratic Republic of North Korea. You know, usually the word democratic is there. It's signalling that actually most people think that those countries are not democratic. That when you read critical community psychology, what you should be interpreting it as is a sign that community psychology is anything but critical. And in fact, maybe community psychology is not very progressive. Maybe it's a little conservative. Maybe it's quite mainstream. And that is an argument that people make. It's an argument that I'd make. It's a shame, because back in the 1970s, things were different. 1970s was a time where there was massive political struggle, big civil rights movements around gender, sexuality, ethnicity, disability. It was a time where a lot of the social power was invested in social institutions, systems of government. It was a time where the corporations weren't quite in the ascendancy, but they were growing in power. But largely in the public imagination, the thing that infringed on their lives was big government. The state telling people what to do. Community psychology adopted those values of empowerment. It adopted the value of diversity. It adopted the value of valuing? I'm an idiot. We don't know if they're principles or values, to be honest. No one's really worked that basic bit out. So we adopted the principle of valuing diversity. The empowerment. Community psychology offered a radical agenda in its early days. These days it's not. A lot of this stuff is in the mainstream. Valuing diversity is the cultural norm now, particularly for the millennial generation. It's been instilled as a core value, that you value difference. Social justice, everyone makes a claim for social justice. The capitalists claim that what they do is with the aim of promoting social justice. They just say they've got a different idea of how to attain social justice. They would say social justice is obtained through people being able to accumulate as much wealth as they want, because that wealth will eventually trickle down to the people who don't have wealth. And it'll do society good. And it'll raise people's sense of ambition and hope and all that sort of stuff. And they'll make their claim that that's working towards social justice. I disagree, but I recognise that they're making that claim, and it gives you the sense that that notion of social justice has loosened. Valuing diversity has become so mainstream. Now the corporate world has jumped on this notion of valuing diversity. The way they've interpreted it is that it opens up new diverse niche markets. You can make more money off of more people. In the 1970s was a very different time, and things have changed. And things have changed very quickly. The speed of change has been extraordinary. We've moved into a whole new industrial era of the Internet of Things, they call it. So some of the central principles to community psychology back then might sit a little differently now because the context has shifted. But we don't seem to have much shifted in relation to those principles. Not much has changed. You know, a few new words have come in, a few new concepts have come in. Wellness. I find wellness a really weird word. Anyway, so the argument is, perhaps community psychology has only really ever been in a conversation with psychology. Maybe community psychology was all about positioning itself against mainstream psychology. It's just an idea. I think there's some merit in this notion, in this argument. It's worth exploring a little, because we haven't seen much movement in the basic principles of community psychology. But what we have seen is huge movement in society, such rapid social change, unprecedented, particularly in the last 40 or 50 years. But it's worth thinking about, because what might be surprising is that given the nature of the change that we've seen in society in the last 50 years, it is a little surprising that the basic principles of community psychology don't seem to have shifted. And maybe it's because those basic principles are timeless. But I don't know. I mean, maybe they are timeless, but when you look at them now, in terms of what those values mean now and how those values and principles have been adopted, and the sort of practices they're engaged in the name of those values and principles, it makes you feel a little uncomfortable. You know, white men are now claiming to be an oppressed group and want their identities valued. It's good news for me, but it's a bit odd, given that we really haven't stepped too far away from the misogynist system of the past. We're still very much in that system. Some people would disagree. Mostly white males. So maybe the fact that these values and principles haven't changed much is a sign that community psychology has only ever really been interested in having a conversation with psychology, not with broader society. And when you look since the 1970s about how much psychology has changed, it has changed. You know, we used to classify homosexuality as a mental disorder. We don't do it now. Some people still do. They're bloody idiots. But we have changed. Psychology has changed, but a lot of psychology hasn't really changed that much. You know, quantitative methods, experimental methods are still the core of the discipline, even though qualitative methods are now more recognized than they were. It hasn't shifted that much. Some people will have seen big shifts in psychology, but when you compare them to the shifts that have happened, careful with that word, the change, the pace of change that's happened more broadly in society, then you don't see that same pace of change in the discipline of psychology, and maybe that's why you haven't seen such a change in community psychology. Not because community psychology adhered to itself to a set of values that transcend time, but the psychology actually community psychology adhered itself to the broader discipline of psychology, which didn't change very much. The reason I argue that psychology hasn't shifted that much is because people working in the mainstream haven't really seen the sort of changes that other people have seen, that they still feel confident in making claims that psychology is an experimental science, that it's an objective science. No need to acknowledge alternative views of what psychology is. So in that regard, the sort of changes some of us have seen in psychology are like a fart in the wind. For many people working in the mainstream, they haven't actually seen the ripples of change go through their work and change their work. They're largely able to carry on with their work unaffected. That's not true in society more broadly, the type of shifts we've seen that have impacted all groups. And even the white supremacists have to acknowledge the arguments that are being made around racism. And they articulate their arguments in recognition of how the ground has shifted, the cultural and political ground has shifted, and now they have to acknowledge the alternative arguments and argue against those alternatives. But there's no real sense that in psychology there's any need to argue against these alternative views of psychology, because it's not seen as a sufficiently strong force in psychology that you in the mainstream need to defend your work against. Largely when you're doing qualitative work, for example, in psychology, qualitative research in psychology, you usually have to start with justifying why qualitative research is important. And that level of justification is seldom required when you're working in quantitative methods or experimental methods. Anyway, there's a little divergence into methodological scientific issues, but it's just to illustrate a point, really, that though there has been change in psychology, it's not been on the sort of magnitude that we've seen in society more broadly, and you can still see the mainstream of psychology operating largely unaffected by the sort of changes that people like me have seen. So maybe that is a long-winded way of thinking about why we now have this thing called critical community psychology, because community psychology may have lost the focus on a political analysis, an understanding of the political and cultural context in which it works, because it's only ever really been focused on the disciplinary context in which it works, i.e. community psychology has been focused on carving out a space for itself within the discipline of psychology to engage in some more progressive, maybe more radical work. But it hasn't been focused on carving out a space more broadly in society to enable us to engage in that politically more progressive and radical work. Anyway, just some thoughts. I'm now getting distracted again by the wallabies. Till next time. Ta-da!